So that bit from the movie Casablanca sort of sets the tone for what was going on in Africa in 1941 and 1942. At the time, Morocco was a neutral country, and all France had been invaded by Germany. There were two parts to France. There was the German-occupied portion of France, and there was the Free French France. Morocco was actually under control of German-occupied France, but it remained neutrality, and it was sort of a meeting place where people from any side could come. And as you can see from the bar scene, there was conflict between the Free French and the Nazi Germans. This all ended in 1942. Operation Torch was the British-American invasion of Morocco, which led to the end of neutrality in Morocco. Soon afterwards, Morocco went over to the side of the Free French. And the changes that took place during World War II involved a rearrangement of the colonial powers, depending on who won and who lost in not only the entire war, but in certain battles. And there was a movement between the Axis and the Allied forces in all of Africa, basically up until the end of the Second World War. And if we look at a map of Africa during this time period, we will see that we have a greatly expanded Italian East Africa, which consists not only of Eritrea, which was the Italian holding before the start of the war, and Italian Somaliland, which was an Italian part. In 1936, Italy invaded Ethiopia and incorporated Ethiopia, which had always been independent, into part of Italian East Africa. The Italians also invaded British Somaliland. The small British garrisons there were forced to flee across to Aden, where they remained for a couple of years. French Somaliland, now known as Djibouti, was part of the German, the armistice that was signed between part of France and Germany, and so it was technically on the side of the Axis, although it was still remained somewhat neutral. And you can see Africa is divided. The hashing, which is all of French West Africa and Madagascar, and French Somaliland are on the Axis aligned, and the Free French, which are the the British and the French Equatorial Africa are the Free French, and where the president in exile is Charles de Gaulle. Now, here's a more detailed area which I'll be concentrating on tonight, talking about Eritrea and also Sudan. And you can see all of this is incorporated into the greater Italy to become Italian East Africa, which didn't last very long because in 1941, Great Britain invaded Eritrea from southern Sudan. The Anglo-Egyptian Sudan was a British protectorate, and their forces attacked Eritrea and rather rapidly defeated the Italians. I'll have a picture later on. I think I was at the site. One of the historic type localities I visited is also the site of the very famous Battle of Keren, where the British military defeated the Italian military, which were forever driven out of Eritrea. And at the time then, Eritrea became a British, not even a protectorate. Britain looked after Eritrea for most of World War II, but didn't really get involved because they were way too busy defending the British Isles and also being part of the Allied forces in outside of more tropical parts of Africa. But what the British did was actually, they just removed the Italian military and allowed the Italian residents and civil servants to remain running the country, because Britain did not have the facilities and enough people to take on a sort of unwanted colony. They just wanted to get rid of the Italians. So they basically allowed Eritrea to remain Italian influenced, but just not Italian ruled. And the civil servants stayed, and even when I was in Eritrea, I've been there now 3 times, there are still some people of Italian descent living there. At the time the British overran Eritrea, there were several hundred thousand Eritreans, or several hundred thousand Italians living in Eritrea, and the downtown architecture of Asmara, the capital, is like 1930s Italian architecture. In fact, Asmara, which just made a UNESCO World Heritage City last June, because of the more than 3,000 historic Italian buildings in the capital. So here is a very brief, it was an Italian colony until 1941. The British invaded from Sudan and the Italians were defeated. There was British administration up until 1950, at which time the British didn't want anything to do with Eritrea, so they allowed it to become federated with Ethiopia. This did not work out very well, and there was what is known as the struggle, which is a very important event where for 30 years a underfunded, poorly equipped British Eritrean guerrilla movement was able to defeat a force of Ethiopians 10 times their size and actually drive them out of the country. And it's known as the struggle, and all the government leaders now were military leaders during the struggle. In fact, the director of the Bureau of Forestry and Wildlife, who was a fighter, had a wonderful story to tell how he was a fighter in the coast of Eritrea, and he was captain in the Eritrean guerrilla forces, and he was able to capture a Russian general and a Russian colonel. The Russians at the time were advising the Ethiopian army, and he actually captured them, and they took them and they sent them back to Moscow. They didn't kill them, they sent them back to Moscow and says, please don't come back, and they didn't. He was interested in wildlife at the time, and he shot a warthog. They were very limited on food in Eritrea during the struggle, and before they were going to take he's a man in his 20s, he had been a student in Russia, and he had come actually back to Eritrea to join the struggle, as did most of the leaders of the government. In fact, the Minister of Agriculture, who's now a good friend of mine, was an undergraduate at University of New Mexico. He got a degree in agriculture. He was admitted to the PhD program in Davis, but before he started as a PhD student in Davis, the struggle started, and he rushed back to Eritrea to join in the fight. But the wildlife director, they slaughtered this warthog, and they were so hungry that before they could take it back to the troop camp, they butchered it and cooked and ate the liver. And when they walked into the camp with this warthog, they started to butcher it for everybody there, and people kept asking, well, where's the liver? And his statement was, warthogs don't have livers. Okay, so the question is, actually I think I skipped one. Why would I want to go to Sudan and Eritrea? Sudan is a civil war, Darfur region, and Eritrea is sometimes called the North Korea of Africa. But other than that, both countries have a number of historic type localities for amphibians and reptiles. And these type localities go back to the 1830s when early seafaring expeditions came down along the Red Sea and continued through the Italian colonization. And they have historic type localities. And I've been involved in a project for some years now with Dan Portick, Jim McGuire's former student, working with some of the samples that I've collected in Eritrea, Somaliland, Somalia, and Yemen. And don't forget, I'll have to read the second part of an email here that I sent to Dave about being kidnapped in Yemen. I'll get to that in a minute. So it's difficult to construct a phylogeny using samples of supposed the same species if you don't have something from the original type locality. For example, if I have a toad from San Francisco and the type locality is New York, is my sample really the New York species? Well, probably not. And that's certainly not likely to be the case in Eritrea if your sample is from 3,000 or 4,000 miles from the type locality of the species, which is exactly what we had to do in this project that was published before I started going to sample some of these historic type localities. These are the toads that we looked at that have different, mainly looking at the Arabian Peninsula, but we have Palearctic species, Asian, Arabian, and African. And what Dan found was in his molecular work that bufo, Pintoni, we had a sample that I had collected in Mauritania and a sample that Dan had collected in Ghana, and it turned out its closest relative was this Bufo tahamicus from Yemen. Well, we're calling these Bufo pintoni, but are they really Bufo pintoni? Because the type locality for Bufo pintoni is right here in Port Sudan, which is completely on the opposite side of the continent. So that, just solving that question mark took me on a 6-week trip to Sudan, just to answer that question. Of course, I did many other things while I was there. And here is Eritrea, and we'll see this picture a couple of more times, but you can see Eritrea is borders on Ethiopia and it borders on Sudan. And one of the reasons that the Ethiopians did not want to give up Eritrea was that Eritrea was the only seaport access to Ethiopia. Ethiopia used the port of Assab, and in fact there was a major highway that went from Assab to Addis Ababa. Of course that is completely closed now because the border between the two countries is heavily fortified. It's been fortified since independence in 1992. And what they refer to in Eritrea is no war, no peace. But it's a fortified border and there's absolutely no contact between the two countries. And the Eritreans are always on alert for an attack, which I'll get to a little bit more further on when in fact there was an attack after independence. But, so you can basically see the topography of Eritrea it's a continuation of the Ethiopian highlands going almost up to the Sudan border. The lowlands along the Red Sea coast, including the Danakil Depression, which is one of the lowest and hottest regions in the world. And then on the western side of the highlands are the western lowlands, which are mostly dry savanna, but with a couple of rivers going through them. And in fact, there's an isolated population of about 300 elephants that are living in the Gashbarka region. So in Sudan, here is Port Sudan, the place where the toad was described in 1893, and nobody, as far as I can tell, ever went back to look for them again. I mentioned this actually in the history of herpetology at the beginning of the semester. And Sudan is mostly desert, a very large area of Libyan desert, the Nubian desert, the troubled zone are the Numa Mountains and Darfur, and of course South Sudan broke off from Sudan a few years ago. But it took me a long time to arrange these trips, both Sudan and Eritrea, because neither government is particularly friendly to the U.S. government for various reasons. One reason Eritrea, of course, is Eritrea gave them no support in their struggles against Ethiopia, because Ethiopia has always had a very the U.S. has always had a very pro-Ethiopian lobby, even back then, and they still do. But I was invited actually by the Minister of Higher Education and Scientific Research for the whole country of Sudan. She is a woman that has a PhD in biochemistry from a university in Australia and did a postdoc 25 or 30 years ago in Florida. And I was asked to come over not only to do field work, but also to sort of introduce them, to this faunal exchange across the Red Sea, and also to help them set up in their natural history museum a collection of amphibians and reptiles. And I brought with me from California a collection of preserved specimens of desert reptiles like chuckwallas, desert iguanas, sidewinder, rattlesnakes, for their collection, so they could put up a display comparing North American deserts with the Sahara Desert, and that's what they are still doing. I was also asked to become an advisor to one of the students. This is Intisar Salala. She's doing her master's degree on the biogeography of saw-scaled vipers and horned vipers in Africa, and I've been helping her with tissues, and I'm on her committee. This other woman is studying geckos, a genus Tarantella. You can see Sudan is a very Islamic country, and people tend to dress as you might expect in an Islamic country. Intisar is less, some people prefer have nothing showing other than their eyes, but So to go to Port Sudan, it's a journey from the Khartoum, the capital. It's about it's 400 miles or so by road, and they were very kind to provide me with not only the students helping NSR and others, but also with a van and a driver to drive up to Port Sudan. On the way, we stopped to look for Euromastix lizards. I had also been an advisor, although I had never met him, on a graduate student in Khartoum who was studying Euromastix lizard. He's since graduated and now is a professor in South Sudan. But we stopped at one of these localities, and these Euromastix here, Euromastix ornatus, I talked about some Euromastix in the last HERP group. This is a specialist that lives in cracks just like chuckwallas, and they're a small lizard. This is Intisar and me with a couple of Euromastix that we pried out of cracks in this southern Sahara desert on the way to Sudan. Port Swakan, the actual type locality is Swakan. It's an abandoned seaport on the outskirts of Port Sudan. So this is the gardens at Swakan, which is the area where the pin-toed toad was described, and as I mentioned, it was named after a medical doctor who was stationed at Swakan as Great Britain was in the process of conquering Sudan in the 1890s. And this is the habitat, the Red Sea Hills behind Swakan, where Bufo pintoni lives. It's now been placed in the genus Chlorophes, but now we have a real pintoni, and hopefully, more than one, several, they were common here, and hopefully once Dan is back in a position with a molecular lab, we'll be able to revisit this toad, this one tissue sample, which was the impetus that made me go to Sudan. It'll be very interesting to see how closely it is actually related to the alleged same species on the other side of the continent.
Does it look like them, Ted?
Sort of, yeah. But you know, toads all look the same.
Yeah.
A bonus was finding a population of African side-neck turtles up here in the Red Sea Hills. There had been reported by the British back in the 1890s, but no specimens existed. And we think it is probably a new species of Pilomedusa. These side-neck turtles have been revised in recent years, mainly by European researchers, although I was involved with here with Jonathan Fong some years ago in a preliminary project on Pilomedusa. What was originally one wide-ranging species that lived all over Africa has now been broken up into 7 species, and there are reasons to think that there are in fact more. And I sent this photo to Uli Fritz, who's the expert in Germany, and he suggested it's probably something new. So that was another bonus from the travel in Sudan. So now let's move down to Eritrea, which has been actually more of my focus. And like I say, 1 trip to Sudan, but now 3 trips to Eritrea. And again, to refresh your mind of the map, we'll start with a journey down into the Red Sea, out to an island off the coast called Green Island. This is traveling with the Director of Wildlife, Futsam Hagos, who's the Director of Wildlife has 3 assistants, Natu, Ellen, and Khalib. 1 interested in herps, 1 interested in birds, and 1 interested in mammals. It's a very small department, but they're very helpful in this research. And as I've mentioned before, this is probably the easiest country in the world to get collecting permits from, because you collect, then you write what you collected, and that's what you get the permit for. It generally takes 10 minutes. On the last trip, it took 20 minutes because the printer had run out of paper. So, on Green Island, we set pitfall traps. This is in these more exposed areas. Even these small pitfall traps are very useful. And they're very easy to set up. This plastic corrugated is stuff that you use to keep the lawn from going into a flower bed. You could pick it up at places like Home Depot. It's lightweight. I think I've probably got now probably at least 3,000 feet of fencing over in Eritrea. I keep taking it over, and we found on this island a new species of Hemidactylus. This has already been sequenced in Aaron Bauer's lab. In fact, just almost casual research in some parts of Eritrea, we have now found 4 new species of Hemidactylus. And this green island is not that remote. It's a tourist attraction from the seaport of Massawa. People go out there to watch birds and snorkel and enjoy the beach. So it's not, you know, in the remote hinterland. I have some pictures of the hinterland coming up in a minute.
Why is it called green?
There's like green mangroves. This is a very dry area. Everything's sort of brown. So I guess if you have a lot of green, it's probably after the green mangroves. This is one of the early discoveries. These a diurnal species of gecko. Not very big. It's maybe, I don't know, 3 inches long, including the tail. And it was described from Massawa, which is the port which is in the background. You can see that's Massawa. Green Island is only a few miles into the Red Sea. This was described by Rupel in 1835 from Massawa. We'll see his name again. He was actually a German explorer who did biological surveys in the 1820s and 30s in the Red Sea, going from Egypt as far down as Eritrea. This is typical habitat of the Hemidactylus. This is acacia savanna south of Massawa. Now Massawa is not too far south of Massawa. You get into the Donegal Depression. I went down there a little bit. I hope to go back and do much more surveys there in the future, but it's approachable from Massawa. And also described, this is taken at a hotel in Massawa. Hemidactylus flaviviridis, the type locality 1835 is Massawa. This is in fact an introduced house gecko, which is in many parts of the world. And it may not even be native to Eritrea, but that's where its first was described scientifically, was from the. Is that also in some of the Indonesian area?
Not flaviviridis. I don't know this one.
Okay, it's widespread all over. It's all over coastal Africa, the east coast. Kenya. It's also coastal Yemen. It's in Socotra Island.
Is it related to Tursicus?
I don't think so. I don't know.
No. Doesn't look like it.
No, I'd have to ask Aaron. Tyodactylus reges, it is fan-footed geckos. These have been recently revised by the Carranza lab in Spain. Carranza and others have divided Tyodactylus up into a number of species, mostly using old names that have been resurrected from synonymy. This was Anderson 1898, a specimen from Ginda, which was actually collected by the Italians when Ginda was one of the major commercial centers during Italian Eritrea. Ginda is on the road between the capital Asmara, which is at the highlands at 7,000 feet, Massawa, which is at sea level, and Ginda, which is about 3,500 feet. So it's about halfway there, and it's a well-watered area that actually still has some remnant primary forest. This is Ginda, and the geckos, of course, are in the rocky areas. This is also habitat for other species that were described from Ginda. I will have some pictures of other things, type locality of Ginda. Acanthocercus annectans is a Blandford 1870. You may recall from a previous HERP group when I was doing a history of herpetology that William Blandford was a British naturalist who was also a medical doctor, and he went on the British military expedition against Ethiopia in the 1860s to rescue hostages that were being held by the Emperor of Ethiopia. And Blandford went along on the trip, and as he went, he collected, including Acanthocercus annectans. I'll have some pictures of the type locality area in a second. Interesting sideline on this expedition, when they finally reached the emperor's palace, the emperor saw them coming. He had a pistol that had been given to him by Queen Victoria as a gift years before. He took the pistol and shot himself rather than being captured by the British. And that was Emperor Tadros II. This is typical highland area on the the uplands of Eritrea. Most of these highlands are between like 6,000 and 7,500 feet, 6,000 and 7,500 feet. This is a euphorbia woodland. This is interesting. This is a very, very famous tree. It's so famous that it is on the back of the Eritrean 5 Nakfa note. And I will pass this around, and this picture, you can't see the tree from where the note, but this is, I'm standing sort of about where this picture was taken for the note. But it's a very famous tree, and this tree, historically, even before the Italian conquest, because it's shady, was a place where the villagers could sit down and have discussions and meeting. And that's common in Eritrea to this day, that there'll be some areas with shade, trees like this, where there may be even rustic benches where people can hold community meetings. This is Ki Haitau, the general area of, this is where Blandford, this is the pass that goes from the coast. They landed, the military expedition landed at the Red Sea coast and marched over a period of 6 months to the Ethiopian highlands, even bringing 100 elephants with them to carry the cannons to attack the palace. But it's gradually up there, and he collected these Acanthocercus in this area. Here we are noosing. They're rather wary, but with patience and with 2 or 3 people with nooses, it's possible. This is some of the typical habitat on the way. This again in the highlands. This is a typical road going from the capital down to the coast. It's very windy.
Have these landscapes all been subjected to goats?
Yes, there are a lot of goats in there. Although this area, this is a national park, and the goats have been, they're no longer allowed in. They have I do a little mention of conservation in Eritrea towards the end, but in case I forget, Eritrea, since independence, has no longer allows any grazing in protected areas. Even if your village is nearby, the villagers are allowed, there's a program called Cut and Carry, where you could walk into the forest with something to cut with. You can cut some branches or some grass and carry it back to your farm and feed it to your goat or cow, but you can't let those animals go into the protected areas. It's quite amazing because these protected areas are not fenced, but when you come up on one, you can walk into it and suddenly you see plants and you don't see any goat droppings, so you know that the system is working. This is a gamma dory. This 1885 from Karen, type locality. As I mentioned, Karen is where the big battle between the British and the Italians in 1941, the deciding battle where the Italians completely abandoned the colony. So male and female in a type locality. This is the habitat. And I actually went there. I'll get to it towards the end. I had a little diplomatic mission in Eritrea, which was introducing the head of the American mission, the head diplomat there, to some of the government officials because she had not been allowed to meet them yet. One of the skinks, Chalchides ragazi, I just got the identification from Aaron. And then the Pule Medusa gahafi. Again, 1835, this Rupel was very prolific with his field trip to Eritrea. This is not posed. These turtles could live in rather tiny bodies of water. It's quite surprising. And this is, Ginda is the type locality. I just showed the picture of Ginda. Here is a turtle pool. And you can see it's not large. These pools actually will dry up, in some sites they dry up in the dry season and the turtles buried in the mud and will stay underground for up to about 6 months waiting for the rainy season to come. One of the interesting things, of course, is the Eritrean clawed frog, Xenopus clevi, 1898, was described by Italians. There was and it's a species, I've already said there's a Xenopus expert who has collaborated with Jim McGuire in the past, Ben Evans, and he's sort of the leading expert on Xenopus. So I have sent him, and he has sequenced Xenopus clavi from the type locality of Seganeti. This species actually, although first described from the Eritrean highlands, it's also been found in the adjacent Ethiopian highlands. He had samples from Ethiopia, but This was the first, I think, anybody had gotten with tissues from the historic type locality at Seganeti. And these toads, they're these clawed frogs. This is now taken in the dry season, and you can see I brought a standard MVZ white bucket, and these are folding turtle traps. They're actually fish traps, but they work amazingly well for xenopus if you bait them with hang a can of sardines with holes punched in it. The xenopus swarm into the traps, and we set 3 traps in this very small pool and trapped over 30 frogs in less than an hour. They were just swarmed in there. There must have been nothing left to eat in the pool. We took about 5 and released the rest. I collected them actually at several surrounding pools, but they're extremely common. Here's another very small pool setting traps. Bait the traps with sardine, tie a rope around it, and just toss it in the water and come back an hour later and pull it out. And you will have frogs. Here's, this is actually maybe the exact type locality. This is apparently a very old well on a formerly Italian-owned farm at Seganeti that abundant in this well. It's quite amazing. I didn't know that. I brought the traps and I got sardines locally, planning to try it side-neck turtles. And I just thought, well, why not try it on the cod frogs, the xenopus, and it worked remarkably well. So the Blandford toad was originally described as Bufo blandfordi by the same Blandford that was on this expedition after the emperor of Abyssinia, now Ethiopia. And the type locality was the Gulf of Zula, which is where they landed, the ships landed. And I went to the Gulf of Zula and found several wetland areas, small oases. The Gulf of Zula is actually in the Donegal Depression, but there are some wetland areas, permanent springs in the northern Donegal Depression. And this is a wetland area. It's spring-fed, and it sort of goes out here and then dries up. And the Blandford toad. And again, this is another one. The type locality, we now have specimens from the type locality. In the project that I did with Dan Portek, we did not have any toads from Eritrea or Sudan. We had what we thought was Bufo blandfordi from Somaliland. Well, it's not like West Africa to the Red Sea, but Somaliland to Eritrea is still maybe 600 miles. So it'll be interesting to see. We don't know yet, and this was one of the other goals, of course, was to get the visit type localities for toads, because in generally amphibians, at least in the right time of year, are fairly easy to collect. You may notice that I haven't you have not seen any snake pictures yet. The reason is, in all 3 trips to Eritrea, I've seen an incredibly tiny number of snakes, less than 10. And of the 10 snakes that I've seen, 7 of them have been saw-scaled vipers of the genus Echis. So here is a more recent discovery. Sclerophes, formerly Bufoxerus, now Sclerophes xerus, described from Ginda in 1976. And this is an extremely wide-ranging toad. It's called the savanna toad, and it ranges basically across the savanna regions of Africa, and it seems to be almost continuous populations. It's everywhere. It's in Ghana, it's in Mauritania, it doesn't go as far down as Somaliland, but Dan had several samples from different parts of Africa, more western parts of Africa that he'd collected. But it will be interesting, again, now we have the savanna toad from the exact type locality. And then there is the Asmara toad, which I'll talk about more in the end, because the Asmara toad has been very good to me as far as me having good relations with the government officials and people throughout Eritrea. I've been on 3 or I guess 4 television programs in Eritrea featuring Asmara toads. I always sort of kept one alive to sort of have in my pocket and sort of pull out at an interview, because you can see it's a very photogenic. It's a sort of smiley toad. But also described from Asmara, the capital Eritrea. So this is Asmara Toad Pond. This is on the outskirts of Eritrea, and these toads are rather common. They're an upland species. They've been since found fairly widely on the Eritrean uplands and also extending into the Ethiopian highlands. So now what we've done is we have talked about the Red Sea coast. Here's Massawa, the type locality. Green Island is offshore. I went down in, here is the Gulf of Zula, where the British fleet landed in the 1860s. We were up in the area up in here, the type locality for the clawed frog. We talked about the big Acantha circus from the highlands, the Agamadori from Karen. The British invasion came from Kassala in Sudan. I've been to Kassala. When I was in Sudan, the pictures I showed of where we traveled, I went as far down as Kassala because I wanted to look. I hoped to find species, the type locality was Tessany, but I didn't. So I traveled up along this area. But the British invaded and they went through Tessany, Barantu, and then eventually in Karen they defeated the Italian army in 1941. So we will now go into Gash Barka. Now Gash Barka is at Western Lowlands, and in many ways that was the most exciting part of the trip for me because it was never surveyed, so there were no historic type localities. Everything there was essentially new. Even the Italians, they got a little bit into Gash Barka, but not very far. And so Gash Barka is a province that is absolutely closed to foreigners. And I was able to get permission because I had, by this time, I had met the Minister of Information and the Vice President of the country. And they were able to arrange permission. In fact, the head of mission, Natalie Brown, I'll show her a picture in a minute, of the American Embassy, first of all, couldn't believe I was even in Eritrea, and secondly, that I could go to places like that, because they had no idea that I was there. It turned out I was the only American that ever since independence had done any field work in the country.
Ted, why wouldn't they allow people into that province?
It's near the Ethiopian border. It shares a very big border with Ethiopia, and there has been some terrorist activity. The tribe there is both in Eritrea and in Ethiopia. And some of the Ethiopians are coming over and planting bombs, explosive devices on the roads. Not very often, but they were just so terrified. Like, first two trips they said absolutely no way. They were just terrified that if something happened to me, it would look very bad for the Eritreans, and it probably would have. But they did, when I did go into the Idu, I did have to, like I had had in Yemen and in Somaliland, we did have people with AK-47s to look after us, but not very many. You could tell how dangerous a place is for how many AK-47s you have in your vehicle. And if you only have one or two, it's probably pretty much okay. But anyway, so this is the governor of the province. There's 6 provinces in Eritrea, and this is the governor, and I learned from the Ministry of Agriculture, who's a good friend of his, that his nickname is Afro because of his hairdo. Everybody calls him Afro. He's very hospitable. He knew we were coming. They notified him in advance so he could arrange the security details for us. And chameleons turned out to be quite common there. There was a large agricultural tree farm, which was well watered, was extremely good for finding all kinds of cool shit. There was like toads, frogs, chameleons, soft-scaled vipers, side-neck turtles. So it was a wonderful place, and he was very pleased. He invited, after we met with him on the first day, he said towards the end of the trip, please come back and bring what you got so we can have a photographer here to do something for our local newspaper. So he was very interested. There he is, and of course, like everybody in the country, the picture of the president for life of Eritrea is on the wall. So one of the things about all over Eritrea, not just Gash Barka, Barantu is the capital of Gash Barka, when visitors come, which in this case was me, you have to plant a tree. There's a huge greening movement. They're planting about 3 million trees a year now in Eritrea. In fact, all high school students are required to spend 1 month of their summer vacation planting seedlings in their villages, because there was terrible devastation during not only the colonial period, but during the 30-year struggle. The Ethiopians bombed and burned the forest just so that freedom fighters couldn't hide. So there's this huge tree planting program, and this is the tree farm at Vertebrate, where before I started doing the collecting, they insisted that I plant 1 tree, and they will take care of it, and I'll be able to, when I go back later this year, see how my tree is going.
They're not
But this-
planting eucalyptus, are they?
They have eucalyptus. They're planting. They're trying now to plant native plants,
okay.
but there is a lot of eucalyptus. And the eucalyptus and the prickly pear, the Opuntia, were all brought in by the Italians. There's huge Opuntia areas now that are, especially around Asmara, and they would like to get rid of it. They haven't yet. This is typical rock habitat around Vertebrate. This is where some of these large agamas live, and also skinks. This is Khalib from the Department of Wildlife. He's a recent college graduate who's the one that's very interested in HERPs. In fact, I've enrolled him in the SSAR, the American Society for Amphibians and Reptiles, and the journals actually get to Eritrea. They're mailed there. I also enrolled Intisar in Sudan, and she only got 1 mailing SSAR. They just see, neither Eritrea nor Sudan have any addresses, so it's kind of hard to get stuff delivered. So this is also, there's a lot of skinks in this area. These were the first skinks I'd ever caught in Eritrea, and what I used it was a method that I know Jim McGuire uses in Indonesia, Aaron Bauer uses it extensively, is sticky traps. But unlike just putting out the sticky trap and coming back later, what Khalid figured out is you see a skink, you chase it into a crack, you put the sticky trap at one entrance to the trap, to the rock, crack, you go to another crack and poke a stick in, and the skink runs out and gets caught in the sticky trap. And it actually worked. He caught about 20 of them in a few days. It was amazing. We also were sampling Pila medusa, because one of the things that I'm interested in is, since Pila medusa are so poorly known from either Eritrea or Sudan, in fact, before I went, the Pila medusa had only been recorded scientifically from the Ginda area, but we have found them now in quite a few sites. This is, again, we're using sardines and setting these traps in this seasonal pool on the edge of Berenta. This is Helen. She's the wildlife person who's very interested in birds. She's a great birder. Hopefully Jackie will meet her in the future. And here is Natu and some of the local people having pulled in trap with Pila medusa in it. In 3 traps, we got about 15 turtles in a couple of hours. Again, it's drying pool and using sardines that just swarmed into the traps. We only kept 3. We let the rest go. But these turtle traps with sardines are an extremely efficient way. Without the traps, I would have never caught a side neck turtle. Maybe that one in the small pool that I showed the picture of. But without the traps, I would have only caught 1 side neck turtle. I would have seen their heads bobbing in the ponds, but can't catch them because if you wade in, they sink to the bottom. Even the clawed frogs, without the traps, I probably wouldn't have caught any.
What are these turtles eating?
Well, when I'm there, sardines. No, I think they're eating sort of any sort of carrion or, aquatic invertebrates. But the fact that they are going so quickly in the traps, they aren't finding much to eat. Now, this is Helen and Caleb with a nice big turtle. So I'm very impressed with the enthusiasm that these recent college graduates are for preserving biodiversity in Eritrea. In fact, I'm overall extremely impressed with sort of the environmental awareness of this tiny country. Poor as it is, Helen lives in, I've been to all these people's house for meal. Helen lives in a house that has occasional electricity. It has no plumbing, no running water. There's an outhouse in the neighborhood, and there's a well. Her salary was recently raised, so it's about $100 a month. So these people are getting by on not very much money, but they're very enthusiastic about environmental preservation. I taught them how to prep, which is of course useful and skillful for them. It also in Eritrea, I'm helping them set up a representative teaching collection to be housed at the Ministry of Agriculture. So when people come through, they can be introduced to the biodiversity of the smaller animals. In fact, that's one of the things they're very interested in. I've given a number of talks there at the universities, and they know about the elephant and the ostrich and the African wild ass and the dugongs, but they don't know anything about the small animals, and they're extremely interested in learning. Here is Natu with a saw-scaled viper, an Echis. This is one that was caught at the tree farm, and we're preparing to tissue it. Do you know Echis?
It's a scary snake.
They're a very dangerous snake. In fact, I talked to one of the doctors in Burintu because people get bitten by Echis. He says, well, if they're near the hospital, we have treatment. And I said, what if, he said, if it takes an hour to get here, they're dead. So it's a very small, dangerous snake, and they're surprisingly common. And most of the people, particularly on the outskirts of Burintu, they're living in very modest lives in huts that are made of mud with thatched roof, and there is no plumbing facility that does the great outdoors as a toilet. So there is a danger, of course, of walking out into those areas wearing sandals at night, because these saw-scaled vipers are actually surprisingly common. The African camellia, collied with an African chameleon, again common at Burintu, particularly in the tree farm. This is a species, it's the Cameleo-chameleon group that was involved in the study that I worked with a number of people with some years ago. It's really still in the genus Cameleo. The genus Cameleo has been subdivided into a number of genera in recent decades, but this remains Cameleo, the same genus as like the European chameleon, the one that's up around the Mediterranean region, Middle East, and Spain. And here is Khalid tissuing one of the Agamadori. They become very skillful at it. And they're very careful. I trust them completely. They learn, both the Eritreans and the Sudanese students very quickly and eagerly learn how did this work. And so I completely trust them to do this, and I will assume they will continue to obtain specimens after I'm gone. In fact, they are. I know that already. So here is another beautiful lizard from the Gashbarka, Acanthocercus Gunther Petersi. It was described, I think, within the last decade or so by a German gamete specialist. And here in Cassina spa, this is a savanna genus that's widespread over Africa. There's a single Cassina has ever been collected in Eritrea. It's caught by the Italians in 1930, one specimen, at a place called Agardat, which is in Gashbarka, but near Karen. So I sent this picture to David Blackburn and Dan Portick. It's probably something new because the nearest known Cassina localities are in southern Ethiopia and in Kenya. And this was, again, I was very lucky. I was at Burintu in the dry season, but there was an unexpected rain. We went out to the tree farm one night and found 5 of these frogs hopping around. So we'll see. The molecular work still needs to be done, but it's a group of frogs that Dan already has a phylogeny of, so it'll be pretty easy for him to see what it is once he gets settled. And like I did with everything that I'm collecting, I collected 5 but left 1 there. Everything I'm collecting now in Eritrea and Sudan, I make sure that they have 1 or more specimens in their representative collection, which I've been helping them to prepare.
Hey,
Very
did you know
beautiful
that
snake,
Tyrone? Did you know that Tyrone Hayes' daughter is named Cassina after Cassina?
The frog.
After the
What's
frog.
a nice name? Yeah. It's better than being called Bufo. So anyway, this is a big skink. This is the size of one of these Algaria alligator lizards that we see in Strawberry Canyon. And the only way to catch them, and again I have to say it was Khalid's method, he got 5 of them by poking them out and getting them to run into sticky traps. One of the sad things about Eritrea, this is remnants of the war, the struggle. And you see this all over Eritrea. You see rusting military vehicles. This was the freedom fighters were able to destroy this personnel carrier somewhere on the road between Karen and Barantu, and it's just along the road, and you see these periodically, these tanks, they're just left there. And so not only was there this struggle in which unknown tens of thousands of Eritreans and Ethiopians were killed, but even after the no war, no peace went into effect, very suddenly in the year 2002, Ethiopia attacked Eritrea again. A huge invasive force came right across the border and right into Barantu, which was that place where I was staying. This place where they didn't really want me to go because they very much remembered the Ethiopian army had attacked and caught the Eritreans completely off guard. They destroyed most of the buildings in Barantu, the capital of Gashbarka. But the Eritrean military quickly mobilized, but it was a few days, but they did come down and were able to drive them back into Ethiopia. And again, the border is re-fortified. That turtle pond I was trapping at in Barantu, where we were using the turtle traps in that drying pond, is only about 20 miles from the Ethiopian border, so they were very concerned about me being there at night. I mean, they did let me go at night, but only with some security people. Nothing happened at all, but they were afraid because it was so close to Ethiopia, and there's a lot of people in Barantu that are probably Ethiopian spies of the same ethnic group. So within hours, everybody in Barantu knew that I was there because I was the only non-Eritrean in the entire province. So one of our goals was that I was working with the people from Wildlife Authority was to, whenever possible, talk about the small animals to the local people. And here we are in a place called Dorfu, which is a little village not too far from the capital. And we're looking for frogs at night, and somebody finds a snake. It's called a file snake. It turns out this was the first file snake ever caught in Eritrea with a known locality. It had been reported in the past once from Eritrea by the Italians, but no locality was given. So don't know any idea what species this is. But so we're showing it to the local people, and you can see finally, of course they're very much afraid of snakes, and perhaps rightly so because you have saw-spilled vipers around. But finally they're getting up a nerve to come up and touch the thing. And you can see that one is willing, the other's thinking about it, and in the end, everybody, boys, girls, men and women, they all were coming up, holding the snake and passing it around. So I was able to explain it's a very distinctive snake. It's called a file snake because the body's triangular like a wood file. It is a very distinctive snake which is completely harmless. So this was one of our goals, was to educate the local people who are already environmentally aware about these smaller animals that they might be often not familiar with or might consider to be poisonous. Like in Barantu, chameleons are considered deadly because that people think they will spit on you and you will die. If you're standing under a tree, they think we'll spit on you. And we were finding them on the tree farm where people were working, and they were horrified that we were touching it. But Helen, being a young lady, was freely handing it, and she could convince the other women that were working in the tree farm actually come up, and finally the whole group of workers, like 20 of them, were passing this live chameleon around. So it's just that there's this feeling often in many parts of the world that things are quite dangerous when maybe they aren't, but the people don't know, but once you educate them, now they know. So this is the famous Asmara toad we put together. This was what was really helped my work in Eritrea, because this poster now is all over the country. It hangs in the president's office. It hangs in every branch of the Ministry of Agriculture. Copies are being printed, some with the help of the American Embassy, which will be passed. Eventually there'll be one of these posters hanging in every school in the country. And it's a very simple poster in English and Tigrinya, and they're very proud of the fact that it's the only toad in the world that is named after the capital of a country. the scientific name is asmari. It was originally called Bufo asmari, and they're very pretty. I mean, you can't believe that even when I'm in town, somebody will walk up to me and say, "You're the toad person," because they saw the poster and me on television. And this is really just this simple poster it's something for them to be proud of. I mean, it's a national treasure. So after that, with the suggestion of Futsum, this was put together. Wildlife is our national treasure. And these are some of the larger animals, the critically endangered African wild ass, the Nubian ibex. These are all species of larger mammals that occur in Eritrea, and they're part of their national treasure. And I'm working on it remotely. We are now preparing multiple additional posters. One will be on the poison snakes of Eritrea, a poster on species of amphibians and reptiles first described from Eritrea. Gradually, they're very enthused about having this promotion of their unique wildlife, because the country is at a very sad existence, and this is something that they can be proud of.
Are there elephants being poached at all?
Huh?
Are there elephants being poached like everywhere else?
Absolutely not. One of the fortunate things is the Eritrean military is also very active working with Futsum Hagos in wildlife protection, guarding the areas. Like the elephants are near the Ethiopian border, so there's a big troop presence there. When I was in Eritrea, my second trip, one elephant was killed by a farmer because it was destroying his crops. And they actually went down and held a training session and basically got the villages together and says, look, in the future, if you have elephants, contact us. We'll do something. Don't kill them. There are about 300 of them. And it's genetically distinct from the rest of Africa, I'm told. There's been some research done on them. So I mentioned about the chief of mission. Natalie Brown is a career diplomat. I think she was on the U.S. Olympic basketball women's team some years ago. She's rank of ambassador, but because of less than perfect relations with the two countries, they refer to as chief of mission, although the function is the same as ambassador. She wanted to meet the Minister of Agriculture, but she couldn't. The protocol would not allow her to call a high government official, and the Eritreans didn't want to call a high U.S. official. So what I did was, since I already had met and was getting along and a friend of the Minister of Agriculture, who had been admitted, remember, as a graduate student at Davis, I was able to invite him to dinner and her to dinner at the same time. So they weren't inviting each other, but I was inviting them together to come to dinner. And so I, what did I do?
You can use the slider there, Ted, next to your orange bracketed slide. There's a slider.
The other side.
Other side.
No? No.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah, that slider on the right.
That's the last
Last
slide.
slide, yeah.
Or second to last slide there, you could pick slide 70. Almost. Where's Jackie?
Coming.
To the rescue. Get the last slide.
All right. Oh, wait.
That slider's there.
It does stop. To be fair, it's a really
Okay.
bad
One
slider.
before.
Oh,
Okay, there we are on the way to Karen. That's the Agamadori trip. So I not only arranged the dinner, but also I invited her to join us on 2 field trips. She's a great birder, and she really much enjoyed going out and learning about birds with Helen. You can see who's quite a bit shorter than she is. And I, of course, want to thank Futsum, Khalib, and Natu for making these 3 trips such a success. And also, I think that's it. Your last one?
That's it.
Well, that's it.
Okay, that's it, right?
yes.
Okay, that's it. Oh, I have to get out of these kidnappers. Remember the kidnappers in Yemen?
You were gonna say, yeah.
For those of you that were not at HERP group, this was a part two. First, part one was introducing, but was more about earlier research in Yemen, the Horn of Africa, Yemen, Somalia, and Somaliland. And I was sending back emails or faxes to the museum today of Wake so I could sort of update them on what I was going. So I ended my last HERP group with this email, which I will just, it's short, I will read. It's two parts. I will just read it. This takes place in Yemen, in the area where you pay ransom in advance so you aren't kidnapped. There was a policy in Yemen, this area I went to near the empty quarter, where if you paid $10 a day, they wouldn't kidnap you, and that ransom then went to the tribe, and they protect you rather than kidnap. So I paid my money, gone up there. The title of the email to the museum is Confrontation in the Dunes. We had been trying to get out of the sand for over 2 hours. It was now very dark with no moon. The 7 Bedouin with me were digging by the light of the flashlight I was holding. Perhaps because they were all high from chewing cot all afternoon, none of them seemed to notice the sound of an approaching vehicle. I heard it but thought nothing of it. Suddenly, a jeep came over the crest of the dune above us. It stopped and 4 men armed with Kalashnikovs jumped out. They were about 30 feet away. Amur grabbed my arm and pulled me to the ground, motioning for me to crawl behind our Land Cruiser. I could tell he was scared as he jammed a clip into his Kalashnikov. The 6 other Bedouin with me, using the 2 trucks with cover, had their Kalashnikovs pointed up the dune at the jeep. The 4 men from the jeep had their guns pointed down at us. 7 against 4, but the jeep was above us, a tactical advantage. To be continued. That's what I left off last week, 2 weeks ago. So, now we continue, and I waited a day before I sent it to the museum, so you could wonder what. Okay. We sent them a day apart to the museum. So let them give them something to think about in case they were having trouble falling asleep some night. That would keep them awake all night.
It was read at HERP group.
Was it?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
with the to be continued. We didn't know what the answer was going to be.
Yeah, okay. After a few tense seconds, a shout of recognition from one of the Bedouin with me ended the confrontation. The 4 men put their guns over their shoulders and ran down the dune to greet us. They were from a nearby Bedouin camp and had heard our commotion in the dunes. They thought we were trying to steal one of their camels. They had a strong cable in the jeep, and they pulled both our trucks out of the sand. So that's the end of the confrontation. That's the end of the talk. That's the end of it.
Can somebody get the lights?
10.
So are there 2 Pelimedusa there?
In Eritrea? Certainly. Maybe more. The thing is, we have not done any molecular work whatsoever on these yet. We do know that Gahafi is a distinct species based on preliminary work in Germany from the dried holotype specimen. It was the dried specimen. It wasn't preserved in fluid, and they were able to get enough sequence out of it to determine that it was part of this revision, where they basically resurrected the old name. No study so far has had any samples from Sudan, and the samples that I'm finding now many places in Eritrea, including on the west side of the Central Highlands. They look superficially somewhat different, but I mean, I'm not really a turtle expert. But yes, I think it's very likely that there are at least 2 species in Eritrea, maybe more.
Are any of them in protected areas?
Yes, there's this fill protected area, has a good population. That's basically around the type locality. Most of the areas where we're finding them, these sort of temporary seasonal ponds, are not in protected area. But there's really so little impact in these areas that And the turtle, nobody in Eritrea eats turtles. And the areas where they seem to be living are not necessarily protected, but they're sparsely grazed or maybe wet season crop growing. But they seem to be fine. I mean, everywhere we look, they're surprisingly common. And fortunately in Eritrea and in Sudan, the turtles are not eating it. The eating of turtles is absolutely forbidden in Islam, which is good for the turtles. Another question? Jackie?
First I wanted to say, because a lot of people have asked me about the availability of the video recordings. I was hoping that perhaps once they get uploaded to YouTube, perhaps they could get sent out to the HERP group.
Sure, just let me know.
Okay, but I do have a question. So what would you say has been the biggest challenge working in Eritrea?
Getting initial permission to go there, because they are a little paranoid about people coming in. Getting less so, because they realize, especially now that they've been declared a UNESCO World Heritage City, there's a tourist coming in to see the architecture. I would say there's really no obstacle. I mean, it's a little expensive to get there, of course, but the cost of living, because the economy is so bad and the salaries are so low, that it's very modest living expenses. Like when I was down in the Donakill Depression at the site where the Blandford toad was discovered, where we were also catching echus out in the desert, the hotel that I was staying at was about 80 cents a night. And you could get a perfectly good meal for 25 cents, the equivalent in Eritrean Nakfa. So, but if your salary is, that's a salary now, a college graduate, of about $100 a month. 50 if you aren't, but there's a maximum salary allowed, like even the president of the country. That's the other thing about Eritrea, the higher level of government is no corruption whatsoever, which is unusual for Africa. The president of the country earns maybe $2,000 a month. He doesn't live in a mansion, but lives in a house. And although I didn't see him, I'm told that he frequently walks from his office into town to get a cappuccino at a coffee shop without a guard.
Where do you fly from or to, or how do you?
What I'm doing now is Turkish Airways. It's nonstop out of San Francisco to Istanbul. In Istanbul, it's about a 2-hour layover, and then it's a nonstop into Asmara, which is about a 5-hour flight. Coming out from Asmara, you have about 8 hours in Istanbul, because you leave Asmara at 2 in the morning, you get there at 7:30 Istanbul, and then the nonstop into San Francisco is around 4. But you know, it's a nice airport. There's a lot to wander around and do. So it's very efficient, surprisingly efficient getting there. Either Turkish Airways daily or Ethiopian Airways daily. The problem, Ethiopian does not go into San Francisco. So if you want to get straight to Europe and then into Asmara, there's fairly limited number of flights into Asmara, just because not a lot of people have a lot of money to go there. Like on both my flights going in and out, this last trip I was the only non-Eritrean on the planes going in and out of Istanbul. But so you could go by way of Cairo on Egypt Air. I think Egypt Air flies out of Los Angeles. And you can also go on Emirates. If you fly to Dubai, you can fly then from Dubai into Eritrea. Yes?
What's the linguistic scenario?
By law, all high school and college courses are taught only in English. The reason being, the president decided independence because of the numerous ethnic groups and distinct languages. The best way to unify a new country was to do away with a language barrier.
So the only national language?
Well, there's also the national language is also Tigrinya, which is in the poster. And the Tigrinya is the indigenous language of the largest ethnic group, which is primarily located in the capital. So people generally grow up speaking their indigenous language. Actually, no, the English starts in middle school. And so everybody, even in the villages, everybody seems to speak English. On the coast, the national language is Arabic. Because one thing about Eritrea, it's sort of a meeting point for three cultures. It's the Ethiopian culture, the Arabian culture, because it's right across from Saudi Arabia, and the Italian culture, because there was a huge colonization and a lot of intermarriages during the colonial period. So you have three, it's very distinct, but for the most part, what is remaining of Arabic, Ethiopian, and Italian is mostly the good stuff seems to be there. The bad stuff they got rid of when they overthrew the various people.
So
like
is
you could have
Arabic
you could get an excellent pizza for $2. A bottle of Asmara beer, which is what I was drinking, and there's $1. The brewery set up by the Italians. At Arake, the national drink there, that's $2 for a bottle.
So is the
Really
Arabic
ruin
like
yourself.
a sort of, I don't know, Quranic official Arabic from Saudi?
Is
or
what?
It's like their local dialect, they speak it in the ports and stuff.
It's pure Arabic on the coast. There's still exchange across the Red Sea. And Arabic, I don't know if it's a different dialect of Arabic, I'm not sure. But I know there is movement back and forth between Eritrea and the Arabian Peninsula. Yeah, Chuck.
I noticed that you went by some ruins in a couple of your slides. What age are those ruins of antiquity, basically?
In antiquity, some of them are going back in excess of 2,000 years. Like that Kahito, which is the type locality for that big lizard. That's original, an Oxamite port which was used during the time of the Egyptian pharaohs.
Huh,
In fact,
okay.
it's interesting, there was a study done that I might have mentioned this at the previous HERP group. There was a lot of trade between Egypt and the Gulf of Zula, which was the main port before the Italians came in. Then it became Massawa. There was a lot of trade back and forth, and in fact, a study was recently done on mummified baboons that were found in the Egyptian pyramids. The pharaohs died, sometimes animals would be mummified and buried with them. And a study was done a few years ago where they sequenced the baboons from the mummies and compared to DNA sequences from throughout the range of baboons, both in Arabia and in East Africa, and found that the match was with coastal Eritrea. So baboons were, and this was in the historians, Egyptian historians talked about bringing baboons and ivory back from Eritrea, and this is like 3,000 years ago. Jim.
So I have three questions about Ethiopia. I'm just going to ask them in rapid
Ethiopia.
succession. Ethiopia.
Oh, yeah.
So do you have an interest in Ethiopia? Are there type localities that you need to visit in Ethiopia? And would the Eritreans disown you if you decided to work in Ethiopia?
Yes, or no, yes, I'm interested, yes,
There are type
type
localities?
localities, and I could probably go there because Futsum Hagos, the director of wildlife, goes to some international meetings. He's the CITES representative for Eritrea, and he also is an IUCN wild horse and wild ass specialist. He has a master's degree in wild asses. And,
A lot of people do.
he periodically goes to meetings where he has Ethiopian colleagues that are working on wildlife preservation in Ethiopia. Eritrea is a member of the Organization of African Unity, and the headquarters is Addis Ababa, and there is a Eritrean representative in Addis Ababa. When Futsum was in Kenya, finishing his master's degree 2 years ago, I helped him get a plane ticket to go back to Eritrea. There was no direct flight from Nairobi to Asmara. So what he did was he flew from Nairobi to Addis Ababa with an Eritrean passport, stayed in the airport in the transit lounge, and then caught a flight to Sudan and then a flight back to Asmara. So it's a sealed border as far as trade going back and forth, but at least the Ethiopian government respects the sort of international activities of the Organization of African Union. But if anybody's watched the news in the last 2 weeks, Ethiopia is about to break out in a massive civil war. There are thousands of demonstrators, hundreds of people have been killed even as recently as a few days ago, because it's an extremely, the government in power is one of the very small ethnic groups of the country. And Ethiopia is a huge country, it has over 100 million people. So the future, at least short term, for Ethiopia does not look bright. So yes, would I like to go there? Probably not right now. But yeah, a lot of type localities.
It's also a notoriously difficult place to get permission to work, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
I was wondering when, if Eritrea has any major exports, and then if there's any amphibians, like in that area.
No amphibians known whatsoever from Eritrea or Ethiopia. They sort of peter out in Somalia. And then when you get further into East Africa, like Tanzania and Kenya, exports you asked about, limited. That's one of the reasons why they're so poor. Up until very recently, haven't had anything that anybody else wanted to buy. But there is now about to open, what will be the largest phosphate potash mine in the world. It will have a lifespan of 200 years, and they are already have contracts with Japan or with China and India to purchase it. It will, once it's opened in another 2 or 3 years, I actually have met the director of it. He's invited me to come to the facility. It's in Donegal. I haven't had time to go there yet. It will bring in probably $1 or $2 billion a year in income. There's a gold mine that's opened in the north of Eritrea. In fact, I was just emailing today about going up in there. It's a recently opened gold mine. There's an animal that is thought to be extinct called the Nubian wild ass, which is rumored to exist in northern Eritrea. I'm trying to get exact information. When I was in Eritrea, before I even knew about the Nubian wild ass, I had a meeting with the Minister of Information, and he asked me if I would help them produce a feature film on the wildlife of Eritrea, which I agreed, and I found an organization that puts out what's called the Travel Channel. And they're willing to fund a feature film on Eritrea. And they would especially like to look for the Nubian wild ass, which may be extinct but may still exist in northern Eritrea. And now, because this gold mine is open, it's feasible to go up in there. I think I could go, but I couldn't take anybody with me yet. They would probably let me go up there because they trust me. So yeah, not much to export. It looks better in the future. And they have to import all their fuel. Eritrea is one of the most expensive fuel countries, even though the economy is so poor. 2 years ago, at the height of the fuel crisis, it was going up for the equivalent of about $12 a gallon.
Geez, what about wind and solar?
They're starting solar, and they're talking about wind, especially on the escarpment, because you get winds coming in from the Red Sea. And they're also, in fact, this one village, Foro, that's the place where you can stay at a hotel for less than $1. I was there 2 years ago. They had no solar. Now all the businesses and most of the houses had a little solar panel provided courtesy of the government of China.
Clever.
Yeah. No, China, in fact, has just opened up a naval base in Djibouti. So China is watching Africa as a place to expand their political and economic influence. Yeah.
Sort of non-HERP, but I was just wondering if there's any outside anthropologists or archaeologists.
There are some periodic Italian archaeologists working on this old site near the Gulf of Zula, where they have just uncovered the remnants of the first Christian church in that part of Africa, dated back to about the year 600. There's an archaeology museum in Massawa, and I met with one of the people at the museum, a young lady who graduated with she actually I think has a master's degree in archaeology from Italy. And she's supervising this exploration of this ancient site. So there's some going on, not a lot, but some.
In anthropology?
Anthropology, I don't know of any. I mean, if you're interested in anthropology, I mean,
No, just curious.
no, I mean, it seems to me,
Ethiopia
I mean,
is
there's a changing, I mean, it took me actually almost 4 years to finally get an invitation. I started working on Eritrea long ago, and every angle I went, dead-ended. Everybody was terrified to invite me. It's one of these countries that's top-down. If the main person doesn't like you, you're in trouble, and everybody's afraid. Unless you're the president of the country, everybody's afraid to say yes.
So it's not like finding your Somali warlord.
No, not signing. The problem is you can't even bribe anybody there. They're not corrupt in Eritrea. I mean, otherwise, pass out the $100 bills, you know. But it was clear that my first visit was approved by the president. And I've heard, and Jim knows the story, he wants to meet me, but he can't officially meet me. But there's a plan afoot. He has a beach house near Massawa where he is sometimes on the weekend. And if I happen to be walking up the beach one morning looking for lizards, and he happened to be out in his garden drinking tea, he would probably invite me in for a cup of tea. But that timing has to be worked out with back channels. It's like Trump and North Korea. You know?
You would be shocked if there was gambling going on.
Yeah. So I guess no. Okay, that's it.
More questions for Ted?
One more. Go
One
ahead.
last question.
Just any idea why there might be that prohibition on eating turtles? I know a lot of these religions that come out of the desert, when they have various food prohibitions, there's some practical reason, like pork or shellfish. Any parasites or any
I don't think so.
reason you
But one
wouldn't
thing
want to
about
eat
these
them?
side-necked turtles, it's the only freshwater turtle. There's many sea turtles nesting off the coast. I think 5 species, big nesting areas. But the side-necked turtles probably taste terrible. They really smell. They have this musk if you pick it up. I mean, you have to wash your hands for days to get the smell off your hands. Nobody would want to eat one. They aren't very big. They're very bony. The few that I collect as specimens, I saw them open and take out liver tissue. There's lots of bone and shell and not much meat inside. So they probably, other than, there would be no prohibition in the non-Muslim population to eat them, but they probably just taste terrible.
Everyone in Papua wants to eat one.
Huh?
Everyone in Papua wants to eat one. They're delicious.
Yeah.
A traditional delicacy.
Traditional delicacy.
St. Zenas?
All right, let's thank
Okay.
Ted.